Amen. I don't know how many of you were impacted by the flu this week, but it certainly got us. So if you were, you can either stay away from me or use a lot of hand sanitizer. I don't know how that works. I'll tell you what. The past, including this week and next week, and the 2 weeks previous to this, these 4 weeks, I mean, they have been and will be, in my life, some of the most transforming passages of Scripture that have impacted and influenced my heart and life. And so I would really encourage you, like if you missed 2 weeks or if you're planning on missing some, like make sure you get online and watch these. These messages have been like seriously breathed into my life. And so like I said last week, when I decided to go through the book of Hebrews, it was really with these 2 chapters in mind. And so they have been very transforming to me, almost as any in all of Scripture. But here we are in Hebrews chapter 11, and we've been here for 17 weeks. And all literally we did last week is define faith. The Bible just lays it out. The Bible gives us a pretty explicit definition of what faith is right there in the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11, and says faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And so we kind of walked that out. We kind of trotted that out to see where that took us and what that really means, because I said, if you go into a regular dictionary and look up what faith means, you're literally getting 17 different definitions. But the good part about it is the Bible went ahead and defined it for us. And so he says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It's not being confident in something. It's actually tasting and seeing and beholding the promises of God, so much so that they are a reality to you. And so it's not just being confident that those things are real. It's not being confident in the promises of God. It's actually having taken hold of them. It's actually tasting and feeling and seeing and sensing and knowing the faithfulness of God and the goodness of God and the beauty of God, and actually having tasted that, having felt that. It's not just a mere confidence, but it's actually an experience of that. It's also the spiritual perception to be able to see the fingerprints of God everywhere. So faith is tasting and seeing the promises of God, not just being confident in them, but actually feeling them. But it's also being able to see those things that God has placed his hand on, namely everything. Right? And I explained it this way, how if you remember a few years back, there was all those 3D images, right? In the mall, everywhere. They went up, and there was all this chaos, but they said, hey, if you stare at this long enough, you get to see the dolphin right behind it. And that's really what the conviction of things hoped for means. It's the evidence that you have seen the fingerprints of God is what? The fact that you see it. No one can tell you that you don't see it. And so really, Hebrews defines it in this way. Being able to spiritually see the fingerprints of God, and also tasting and seeing the promises of God. And from there, where we're moving today is really just a who's who in Old Testament Christian faith. And really, all we're going to do is just kind of define what faith is, what it does. We talked about what faith is last week, and this week we're just going to talk about what faith does, what faith looks like, how that plays out, the characteristics of faith. And so what I'm going to do is, I don't know any other way to do this. I'm literally going to read all the way through starting in verse 7 all the way to verse 40, and then we're going to kind of work our way back and look at what faith does. And so we just have to read this text together, and we'll stop a couple times here, but stretch your eyes out because we've got some reading to do here, okay? Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 7, all right? Here we go. That's where we left off. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning the events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he commended the world and became an heir to the righteousness that comes by faith. And so what we see right away is God told Noah something, and Noah responding to what God told him. Let's keep moving. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place and to receive an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him from the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. I love this verse, verse 12. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand on the seashore. And so, right away, I just want to point out what we're seeing is God commending these people in their faith, right? Not that they are blindly doing things without having anything to go off of, all right? That's not what they're being commended for. They're not just saying, you know what? Abraham didn't just say, I haven't heard from God. There's been no promise. I'm just going to start walking, right, in a certain direction and hope that God blesses where I end up. That's not what happened. Noah didn't decide one day to just build an ark on his own, step out in faith and just start building a boat, thinking maybe one day there was going to be a flood. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is God is promising something, and these people are responding to what God has promised. And then just a side note here, anybody who tells you that the fact that Abraham and Sarah had a child so far late in their lives isn't a big deal because people lived longer back then, Hebrews says he was as good as dead, all right? That's pretty old, okay? So that's still a miracle. Let's keep moving here. Verse 13. This is a big verse that we're going to do a lot of work in today. We'll come back to. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them afar, from having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, or anticipate a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Verse 19. He considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Verse 20. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of his sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Okay, so the whole thing here in verse 22, real quick, with Joseph, people think, why is it a big deal that he gave his kids directions concerning his bones? Well, they wouldn't see the promised land for 300 years later, right? It wouldn't be 300 years until they were going to bury his bones. That's some anticipation of a better day. Let's keep moving. We got to get through this, and then we'll start to actually get to work. Verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Verse 26. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of a king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover, sprinkled the blood, that is, the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch him. Verse 29. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. This is some of my most favorite scripture in the whole Bible, starting in verse 32. And what shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. And then there's a switch here, verse 35. Women received back their dead from resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking, flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword, they went out in skins and sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. Last two. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. All right. So there are some things in this text that we have got to see. There are some things, and I'm just going to list them out really simple, some things that faith does. And the first one here that we see all throughout this text is number one, faith always anticipates a better day. Flatline. Faith always anticipates a better day. Faith somehow sees the future and believes that the future is coming. Like if you go through this passage, what you're going to see is all of these people being able to do what they're doing because they're anticipating a better day to come. Without the anticipation that there is something better, faith simply does not exist. You tracking with that? Like if you are completely content with everything in your life and everything spiritually and everything else, you cannot have faith, because faith is an anticipation of the promises of God coming true in our lives and in this earth. You see it through this whole passage. Every person, Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Moses, they did what they did. They said what they said. They were where they were because they anticipated a better day. That's how it has to be for us. Faith anticipates that the promises of God will come true. No matter how long it takes for them to come true, no matter how much we have to persevere, no matter what it looks like, faith always anticipates a better day. That's why I'm always pleading with you to be in the scriptures. That's why I'm always pleading with you to read the text. That's why I'm always saying, hey, let's open the text, because it's only in the text that we find the promises of God. And it's only the promises of God that creates this anticipation in us for a better day. Like if you're not in the Word and you don't know the promises of God, then you're not going to have an anticipation for those promises to come. That's all there is to it. Like faith always anticipates a better day, but you don't know what that better day is. You don't know what the promises of God are if you're not in the text. And what happens when you don't know what God says He's going to do? You get stuck in this faulty religion and you try to obtain those things by yourself and through external actions. But if you look at the text, what we see is these people believed in the promises of God and hoped in them. They anticipated in them. And that's really the first thing that we see all throughout this whole passage. Number one, faith anticipates a better day. But not only does it anticipate a better day, faith moves, right? Faith acts. It's not stagnant. Like, let me say it this way. Faith never sits down and twiddles its thumbs, okay? In this passage, when you look at it, faith doesn't go, oh, well, God's going to take care of this for me, so I'm just going to sit here and wait for God to take care of this for me, and then when He delivers it to my doorstep, I'll rejoice in it. That's not what faith does. This text is not saying that God did everything for them, and all they did was sit there and believe that God was going to do it. That's not faith. Faith always anticipates, but faith always moves. It always acts. Look, I mentioned it. Verse 7, what does Noah do? He goes and builds the ark, right? He didn't sit there and let God build it. He had to go build it. Faith acts. Abraham, what did Abraham do? He left. Man, he had to leave his whole family. He had to leave everyone behind. He had to leave everything he knew. He had to act. Listen, this might be a little hard to hear, and it's a little uncomfortable, but even Sarah and Abraham had to act to have the baby, right? I mean, it wasn't an immaculate conception, was it? I mean, they had to move. That faith moves. Faith moves. It acts. Look at verse 32. This is probably the best example of it. And what more shall I say? For time would fail for me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and all these people. Verse 33, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained the promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire. How did all that happen? How did it all happen? You think they just sat there and waited for God to conquer the kingdoms? You think they sat there and waited for God to shut the mouths of lions? You think they just waited for all that to happen? No, they moved, they act, they took steps of faith. I mean, just look at the whole story of the Old Testament. What does God tell the children of Israel when they're leaving Egypt? He goes, you know what? I've given you the promised land. Now what? Now go get it. What's God saying? It's yours, but you got to show faith to go get it. You actually have to act. You're actually going to have to conquer. You're actually going to have to do the work to get it. It's yours, right? That's the promise of God. It's yours, but you're going to have to do the work. You're going to have to go in there and get your hands dirty. Isn't that what the whole Old Testament is about? God's saying, yeah, faith anticipates a better day, but faith doesn't stand still. Faith always moves. Faith always acts. It's not just sitting stagnant. It's not just sitting twiddling its thumb. Faith moves, man. It's not stagnant. It does not terminate on itself. It moves, it shakes. Faith always does work. So let me make it real for you in this place. Let me make it real for me in this place, because I'm always saying things like this is a place of healing, that if you come to Jesus, you can be healed, you can be made whole, you can have that abundant life. We all have wounds, we all have sins, we all have brokenness. You're always hearing me say this. You're always hearing me say things like, yeah, it's okay to not be okay. And you're sitting there going, yeah, I've got some wounds, I've got some sins, I've got some things in my life that I know I need to be healed from, I know I need to be made whole from. I know that, I know the language, but you're still sitting there. You're not moving at all. That's not faith. That's something else. I don't know what it is, but it's not faith. You don't have faith if that's you. You might have religion, but you don't have faith, because faith moves. Faith does not stay in the same place. So we can come in here and say, I believe Christ can heal me. I believe Christ can make me whole. I believe Christ can take this out of my life and bring me wholeness. I believe that he can take all of these things away from me and bring me an abundance of life. He's called me to confess this, but I'm not going to confess it. Why? Well, it's embarrassing. Well, that's pride. Well, I don't really actually believe that he can do it. Now we're getting to the bottom of things here. You see, you can believe that Christ can make you whole. You can believe that he can forgive you. You can believe that he can bring you that abundant life. But if you're just still sitting there listening to the same language that you've heard for years and years and years, you don't have faith. You have something else. Because what faith does is move. What faith does is confess. What faith does is pray. What faith does is come forward to get the leaders and the elders of the church to lay hands on you. Are you tracking with what I'm saying? I mean, when you read this passage, yeah, faith always anticipates a better day, but faith is always moving. It's always acting. It's always doing something. It's not ever standing still. So if you have been sitting there for some period of time thinking, yeah, I know that I need to be made whole. I know that these broken places in my life need to be mended. I know that the crooked paths in my life need to be made straight. I know that I'm a slave to this, that, or the other. I know I'm literally enslaved to this sin, to this weight, to this thing in my life, but you're still sitting there. Do not fool yourself. What you have is not faith. You might have religion, but you do not have faith. Because the Bible has made very clear faith moves. Doesn't just believe, but it moves. It acts. I mean, you can go to the whole chapter of James chapter 2. And what's going to happen? James chapter 2 is the words faith and works are used literally interchangeably. Not because faith produces works, but because he's trying to get the point. They're the same thing. That this is not two separate words, but faith and works are together. They are the same. You see, there's always been this dichotomy in the church. Literally, if you read the old reformers, they hated the epistle of James. They called it the epistle of straw. Martin Luther hated it because he saw a dichotomy between faith and works, but that's not what the Bible's saying. The Bible's saying faith and works are the same thing. They're the same thing. You can't separate them. Let me read this real quick. I didn't plan on doing this, but let me read it. James chapter 2, verse 14. You don't even have to turn there. Let me read it to you. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed or lacking daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace and be warmed and filled without giving them the things needed for their body, what good is that at all? Verse 17. So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. So let me unpack this. Go back to 12th grade biology class, okay? And pretend that there's a skeleton hanging here on the stage just like you had in biology class. Now, is that skeleton just the bones? Is that a human being? No, right? It's just bones. The human being is long since dead. All you have now is bones. What James is saying, what the Bible is saying, faith without works is if you have faith without works, it's not faith, right? All you have is the bones. I mean, you don't have anything else. You don't have life. You don't have anything. What he's trying to say is faith moves. They are together. The words are interchangeable. You just can't have one without another. He's not putting them against each other. There's no dichotomy. James and Paul are not on opposite sides. James is simply saying the words are interchangeable. Faith comes first. Yes, you're not working it out, but they're the same. All you have is a skeleton if you just believe but aren't moving. All you have is the bones if you think you know, but you're not confessing. Are you tracking with what I'm saying here? The whole chapter of Hebrews 11 is trying to tell us something. Yes, faith anticipates a better day, but faith moves. It acts. It always moves. It always shakes. And so faith anticipates. Faith moves. And here's the third one. Faith always perseveres. Check this out. Verse 13. Chapter 11. After he named a bunch of people, he says, these all died, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. So God comes to Abraham and says, or Abram at that point, and goes, Abram, I'm going to build a city. I'm gonna build a city, and out of this city for you, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. It's going to be glorious. It's going to be so numerous like the stars in the sky, like the grains of sand on the seashore. It's going to be amazing, Abraham, and it's coming for you. You know where Abraham dies? In a tent. He never get to see that city. He never get to see that promise. He never get to see that come true. He anticipated a better day, but he never got to see it. Faith always perseveres. How about verses 35 through 38 here? Women received back their dead. Some were tortured, right? Some suffered mocking and flogging, chains and imprisonment. Verse 37, they were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They were destitute in the mountains, in dens. So yeah, faith, no matter what, always perseveres. Man, whether you never get to see the promise, no matter what you have to go through, faith always perseveres. That's what he's trying to tell us here. And then just one more on that, verse 39. And all these were commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. And so what he's saying here is we found ourselves caught up in a story that began long before us and will play out long after us if Jesus tarries. That you and I, catch this, you and I are about a 2-second soundbite on God's timeline. We are part of a greater story so that we do not get caught up in ourselves, but we get caught up in the bigger story of God and what he's doing that our faith perseveres through that. Because I got news for you. If you're caught up in yourself and you make this whole thing about you, you cannot persevere. But if you see the bigger picture, but if you see the bigger picture, the picture of Hebrews chapter 11, where they didn't see everything. Even Abraham didn't see all the promises, and they didn't get them all, but they anticipated a better day. Then you can persevere. Faith perseveres. It clings to the fact that God has something better for us. Faith clings to the fact that there's a better country, there's a better possession. It clings to the fact that we have not been abandoned. Faith perseveres. Faith anticipates, and faith always acts. It sees the promises of God in the future, and it begins to hope for them. Faith always anticipates. Faith always moves. Faith always perseveres. Now let's look at this next part real quick. Chapter 12. Therefore what? Therefore, since faith always anticipates, therefore, since faith always moves, therefore, since faith always perseveres and acts, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. So what he's saying here is, okay, since faith always anticipates, since it always moves, since it always perseveres, since Abel, since Enoch, since David, since Abraham, since Jacob, since Moses, since there's this whole great lineage of faith, since all these people, always be leery of people who try to preach Hebrews chapter 12 without chapter 11, because that's who it's talking about. He says, let me paint the picture. Therefore, since faith always anticipates, moves, perseveres, and since we have this great lineage of faith, let us. What's he saying there now? He's saying now it's our turn. He's saying now it's your block of time. That they've run their race and they've run it well. They anticipated, they acted, they persevered, they did amazing things. Since they're crying out from the grave to you, since all of that is true, now it's your turn. Now let us. So now included in this amazing group is you and I. Now included in the great hall of faith, now included with Abraham and Moses is you and I. And here the author goes, now it's your turn. These people all ran well, but now it's your turn. He says, since we're surrounded by all of these people who've been so faithful, who've anticipated all the promises of God, who acted in faith, who persevered whatever came their way, since they're literally crying out from the grave to you, let us lay aside every weight and sin. Do you like how he delineates between weight and sin? Like everything in our life is not sin. Are you tracking with that? The people often come to me and say to me things like, is this sin? Is this a sin? And I say, you know what? I don't know if it's sin, but it's certainly not wise to do. There are things in our life, just because they're not sinful doesn't mean we don't need to throw them off. Doesn't mean we don't need to get rid of us because they're hindering us from running the race that God set before us. You see, yeah, there are sins that are holding us down. There are actual black and white, hey, here's what God says in his word. This is a no-no. Don't do it. Actually run from it and do this. But then there's these things in our life that aren't inherently evil, aren't inherently bad. They're just weight, man. They're just things that hold us down, hold us back from running the race that God has for us. So people say, hey, man, is this sin? Is this sin? Is this sin? And I'm like, I don't know if it's all sin to you, but I know it's not wise. I know it's holding you back. I know it's entrapping you. I know it's not allowing you to run the race that he has set out for you. So he says, therefore, since we, that's us, you and I, are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us, you and I, also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run the race with endurance that is set before you and I, us, looking to Jesus. Looking to Jesus. Okay, two parts here I want to hit on before we close. Number one, I love the fact that this text continually says, let us, we have to, let us, we together, us together are in this together. What point is he making there? He's simply saying that you and I together were put on this earth for here and now to run the race that he has put before us. Together. That we're not running this thing alone. You think Abraham did it alone? You think Noah did it alone? You think Moses did it alone? No, man. They had those people with us. They had their we's. They had their us. God has purposely placed us together to run this race. He says, now it's our turn. Young and old, simple and not so simple, black and white, right? Rich and poor. He goes, you guys, it's your time together. Let us run this thing together. And what will they write about us? What will they say about us? What will our kids say about us? If we're surrounded by such this great cloud of witnesses screaming out to us, and he goes, now it's your turn. You get about a 40-year block, man. You get a generation. You get about 40 years to run this race. What are they going to say about us? What do we do? Well, what's going to be written down about us? What are we leaving behind? And all of a sudden, you get a little intimidated. All of a sudden, it's like, man, I don't have any idea what would be written about me. Man, I've shared my faith a little, but I mean, it's not worthy to be in Hebrews 11. Man, I'm a pretty good person, but you ain't putting me next to Moses. Well, listen to what he tells us to do. He says, looking to Jesus. He says, look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right-hand throne of God. Consider him. Consider the Lord. Who remembers that old song that we used to sing, that everyone used to sing? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Who remembers that? Look full on his beautiful face, right? Wonderful face. That's what he's telling us to do. Listen, you don't become like Christ before you behold Christ. Tracking with that? Don't get it backwards. You're not going to become like Christ without first beholding him. And this author's saying, man, you have to behold Christ. You have to set your eyes on Jesus. Man, he is the author and the perfecter of this thing. And so what the text is saying is, therefore, since faith always anticipates, therefore, since faith always moves, therefore, since faith always perseveres, therefore, since we have such a great lineage of faith, such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run the race. Let us lay aside all the weights in our lives that hold us back. Let us lay aside all the sin that hold us back. Let us run that race with endurance. And when we get intimidated, let us look to Jesus. Set our eyes upon him. Behold him, and then we become like